have overwhelming military power. They can strike almost anywhere. They can destroy almost anything. Entire command structures were wiped out overnight. And yet, the war is still not over. In the first days of this conflict, that power was on full display. Hundreds of airstrikes, precision attacks. Entire layers of Iran's defenses collapsed in hours. By every conventional standard, this should have been decisive. This should have been the moment the war effectively ended. But it didn't. Iran is still fighting. The region is on fire. And the war is still not over. That's where the contradiction begins. Because if one side can dominate the battlefield this completely, why haven't they won? And more importantly, can they actually win at all? What's happening here breaks the pattern completely. This is not a war where victory is defined by who destroys more. It's not even clear what winning looks like anymore. Because the deeper you look at this conflict, the more it starts to reveal something uncomfortable. That overwhelming power might not be enough. And the outcome of this war may not be decided by who strikes harder, but by something no one fully controls. This is where everything changes. To understand this, we have to step back for a moment. Because what's happening right now did not begin with a single strike. It is the result of a longer buildup, one that made this conflict almost inevitable. Tensions between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been rising for years. But this time, it crossed a line. And then something unexpected happened. What followed was not limited. It was coordinated. And it was designed to achieve very specific goals. At least that was the plan. Break Iran's military, shut down its nuclear future, and if possible, bring the entire system down. In the opening phase, it looked like that strategy was working. Air defenses were overwhelmed within hours. Military infrastructure was heavily damaged. Senior leaders were taken out in rapid succession. By every historical pattern, this should have been the end. For a moment, it created a powerful illusion that this war would follow a familiar script. Strike hard, remove leadership, break the system, and then everything falls apart. But that's not what happened. They removed key leaders, and the system still didn't collapse. The regime held, the structure remained, and the war did not end. But that's not the most surprising part. And because what looked like the beginning of a quick victory was actually the beginning of something far more difficult to control. And that's when everything stopped making sense. At its height, the opening phase of the war looked decisive. It looked like the war was already over. The strikes were relentless. Wave after wave of missiles and aircraft hit their targets with precision. Air defenses were no longer a serious obstacle. Command centers were exposed. Key infrastructure was being dismantled in real time. From the outside, it looked like total control. The kind of control that usually ends wars quickly. This is usually how wars end. The weaker side collapses. The system breaks. And whatever remains is forced to negotiate or disappear. By every standard we've seen before, as this should have been that moment. But this wasn't the end. And then something unexpected happened. Instead of collapsing, Iran responded. Not symbolically, not weakly, but in a way that made it clear the war was far from over. Missiles lit up the sky, drones flooded the air, and it didn't slow down. American bases were hit. Regional infrastructure came under attack. The conflict began to stretch outward, pulling more actors into its orbit. And the situation was starting to spiral. This is where the pattern starts to break, because the assumption was simple. If you remove leadership, the system fails. If you destroy infrastructure, the resistance fades. If you dominate the battlefield, you win. But none of that happened. They removed key leaders, and the system kept functioning. They destroyed major capabilities, and the attacks continued. They controlled the skies, but not the war itself. This is where the illusion becomes clear. Military dominance created the appearance of victory, but appearance is not outcome. Because what matters is not how much damage you can inflict, but whether that damage changes the behavior of your opponent. And in this case, it didn't. Iran adapted. It absorbed the impact, and it continued to fight. And that's when the war stopped looking like a short conflict and started looking like something much longer, something far more difficult to end, something that might not end at all. This is where the war stopped being contained. Because once Iran absorbed the initial shock, it didn't just continue the fight, it expanded it. And that changed everything. What began as a concentrated campaign started to spread across the region. Missiles didn't just target military sites anymore. They reached deeper, closer to critical infrastructure, closer to the systems that keep everything running. And once that pressure starts, it doesn't stay contained. Ships slowed down, some stopped moving entirely, and the flow of energy began to tighten. Suddenly, the conflict wasn't just regional anymore, it was global. This is where the stakes shifted, because the battlefield was no longer just land or air. It was the global system itself. And at the center of that system was a narrow stretch of water, the Strait of Hormuz, a place most people never think about, but one that quietly controls a significant portion of the world's oil. If this point is shut down, the world feels it almost immediately. If fuel prices spike, supply chains strain, and the effects are felt far beyond the region. And if it stays blocked, the pressure doesn't stay contained. It builds across markets, across economies, across countries that have nothing to do with the war itself. And once it reaches this point, it's much harder to stop, because this isn't just a battlefield anymore. Reopening a route like this takes time. It takes coordination. And during that time, the pressure builds globally. This is no longer just a war of strikes and counterstrikes. It's a war of pressure, a war of disruption, a war where the objective is not just to win battles, but to force consequences. And once that begins, the question is no longer who is stronger, and no one fully controls what happens next. This is the limit of power. I'm not who can strike harder, not who controls the skies, but whether this war can actually be finished. Because everything so far has led to one uncomfortable reality. Destruction is possible. Control is not. From the beginning, the objective was never just military. It was to change the outcome entirely, break the system, force collapse, end the war on terms that could be controlled. At least that was the plan. But that kind of victory requires something very different. It doesn't come from airstrikes alone. It requires control on the ground. And that's where the problem begins. Because even after everything, after the strikes, after the damage, after the loss of key leaders, the system is still standing. And that's the problem. Because if it doesn't collapse, it doesn't end. The structure holds, the pressure continues, and the war moves forward without a clear finish. And the options begin to close, push further, and risk something much bigger. Hold back and accept that the war continues. Neither leads to a clean victory, and that's the part most people miss. Power can break things, but it doesn't always decide what happens after. And in this case, that after is everything. Because once a war reaches this point, it stops being about winning quickly. It becomes something else, something slower, something harder to control, and something that may not have a clear ending at all. This is where the war becomes impossible to finish. Not because one side is weak, not because the fighting has stopped, but because there is no move that ends this cleanly. Because at this stage, every option creates a new problem. The United States and Israel still hold overwhelming power. They can strike again. Targets still exist. They can escalate further. They can increase the pressure. But none of that guarantees an ending, because the system they are trying to change is still functioning. And as long as it holds, the war continues. And it is still holding. Push further, and the conflict expands. Pull back, and the pressure remains unresolved. There is no reset. Only choices that shift the consequences somewhere else. And over time, those consequences build. Prices shift. Decisions change. Pressure spreads. Not just in the region, but across the global system. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to predict what happens next. Because this is no longer a controlled situation. Every step forward creates a new problem. Every attempt to contain it reveals another limit. And that's the moment everything changes. Because once a war reaches this point, it stops being about winning. It becomes about managing what cannot be fully controlled. And once it reaches this stage, no one is fully in control anymore. What you're looking at is not just a war. It's a pattern where overwhelming power can dominate the battlefield, but still fail to control the outcome. Where strikes can destroy, but not decide. Where pressure can build, but not resolve. Because if you look closely, this is not just about the United States, Israel, or Iran. It's about how modern conflicts actually work. For a long time, victory seemed simple. Win the battles, break the enemy, end the war. But that model doesn't hold anymore. Not here. Because the system you are trying to defeat doesn't collapse the way it used to. It adapts, it absorbs, it continues. And that's why conflicts like this don't end the way people expect. And that changes everything. Because now, winning is no longer just about force. It's about what happens after the force is used. And that's the part no one can fully answer. Because even when one side dominates, something still remains. And as long as it remains, the war doesn't end. It evolves. And that leads to the real question. Not whether the United States and Israel can win, but what winning even means in a conflict like this. Because you can win every battle, and still not control how it ends. And that may be the most important thing this war reveals. So what do you think winning actually looks like?